Okay, so it's already filming, I'm pretty sure. As I was noticing, you guys can hear me quite well. So. Hey everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of bioethics. This class, as I said, would have a nice view, but it looks like the mountains are getting snow today and it's pretty windy, so hopefully these videos work out. But yeah, I'm just trying to do something a little different. But anyway, so let's jump in. Today we're going to talk about the concept of ethics and morality in general, and then get more specific into bioethics, and then even more specific into the bioethical principles that we're going to be using throughout the course. Okay, so first we need to think about the difference between ethics and morality. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about ethics and morality, used these terms before, probably interchangeably. Most people do use these interchangeably, even philosophers. The textbook makes a distinction now. So morality is going to be this broader concept, whereas ethics is going to be the specific philosophic approach to morality. Now, there are other approaches to morality. You could have a historical approach, you could have a sociological approach, you could have an anthropological approach. These are going to be slightly different than what philosophy is doing. Those approaches are going to be more descriptive ethics. They're describing how people have acted, or how they might have acted in the past, or things like that, or what they thought was ethical. Whereas the philosophic approach is going to be applying critical thinking, and it's going to be applying critical reasoning skills to these ethical problems and questions and cases. Okay, so ethics is a part of philosophy. This part of philosophy we're going to be approaching. There's three main branches in philosophy. There's going to be metaphysics and epistemology, and then there's ethics. So metaphysics is, asking the questions like what's really real. Epistemology is asking the question like what is knowledge? How do we know things? And then ethics is asking, how should we interact with each other? How should we treat each other? So then within ethics in particular, we also still have three subdivisions. We're going to have meta-ethics. These are going to be asking questions like what is good? What is goodness in itself? What is blameworthiness? And then we have normative ethics. These are going to be ethics about, or questions about the norms. What principles, rules should we be following? And how should we be following them? And then finally, we're going to have applied ethics. This is going to be our third subfield of ethics. There's a lot of different, applied ethics. What this is doing is taking the norms and trying to apply them to specific cases. So you could have applied ethics, we're doing bioethics, but you could have applied ethics in business. You could have applied ethics in the environment. You could have applied ethics, you can apply ethics in any situation. So we're specifically looking at the bioethics field, the subdivision within ethics that's applying ethical principles and standards to cases around medicine, or biology or things like that. Okay, so why would you take a bioethics class? Well, the cases that were being considered, they're usually kind of weighty. They're very heavy topics. We're thinking about abortion, we're thinking about death, we're thinking about organ donations. These are going to be very heavy, weighty topics. And as long as you're a person, you're probably going to experience one of these, whether it's with your mom, your dad, yourself, your partner, whoever. At some point you're going to be faced with these weighty issues. So thinking about them ahead of time, and reading some of the best thinkers that we've ever had think about these topics can help you when you're experiencing these cases yourself. So as I started editing these videos on the plane back from Denver yesterday, I realized that the microphone wasn't always working. So I'm going to have to do a couple re-recordings of the first videos here in my studio apartment in downtown Santa Barbara. Okay, so we were talking about bioethics and where it fits in the field of ethics. So bioethics is going to be a field of applied ethics. and that we're going to take the moral norms and standards from normative ethics and be applying them to specific situations in medicine and biology and human research. So we're going to be talking about moral norms. Moral norms are going to be different than social norms or grammatical norms or aesthetic norms by using because of these 4 specific characteristics. So moral norms are going to be dominant, universal, impartial, and reasonable. So let's go over each one of those in particular. Dominance is going to be that moral norms dominate, they override other kinds of norms. So we have an aesthetic norm and we have a moral norm, treating people respectfully. And then an aesthetic norm, like, this is what looks good or, what would look good. And it's like, if we have to, shush some homeless people away to make it look better, then we should do that according to the aesthetic norm. The moral norm is going to say, no, we need to treat people, like human beings. So then because of that, we're not going to push them away. So the moral norm is overriding in that circumstance. That's what that's going to say. So another thing is moral norms are going to be universal, which means that they're applying in all relevantly similar situations. If the situation is pretty much the exact same, but it's a different person, then it's like, okay, you need to apply the same norms in those same situations. Like you need to find a morally relevant difference if you're not going to be applying the same standards in both cases. So that universality is about the cases, whereas impartiality is about the people. So when we're applying moral norms, we need to apply them equally to everybody. Everybody's interests should count equally, especially in terms of utilitarian calculations. You can't just think about your interests or your patient's interests. You need to think about your patient's family's interests. You need to think about the other medical community's interests. You have to think about the broader community as a whole. So these are, to be impartial, it's not that everyone needs to be treated equally, it's that everyone's interests need to be counted equally. Okay, so there's a really good James Rachel's quote from the textbook. I'm just going to read that to you guys. So this is, the requirement of impartiality then is at bottom nothing more than a prescription against arbitrariness in dealing with people. It is a rule that forbids us from treating one person differently from another when there's no good reason to do so. But if this explains why racism is wrong, it also explains why in some special cases it's not racist to treat people differently. Suppose a film director is making a movie about the life of Martin Luther King Jr. He would have perfectly good reasons for ruling out Tom Cruise as the star role. Obviously, such casting would make no sense. Because there would be a good reason for it, the director's discrimination would not be arbitrary and so would not be open to discrimination. So this ties into reasonableness. We need to have reasons for why we're accepting a moral norm. Moral norms should, withstand other scrutiny, not just your own rational reflection, but you need to think that others will also agree with this. This is going to try and prevent us from having knee-jerky reactions. Our emotions can sometimes be misleading, so we need to stop and reflect and think, okay, why am I following this moral norm? What is this moral norm trying to achieve? Okay, so morality in general, you've probably thought about it in terms of a couple different ways. We have moral obligations and duties, but then we also have moral judgments, thinking about when a situation's good or bad, or when something's right or wrong, or when someone's praiseworthy or blameworthy. We also sometimes use good in a non-moral sense. This would be something like, so that bicycle is a good bicycle, although it's not, it's kind of bad. But it's not good or bad in the moral sense here. It's good or bad in how well it functions as a bicycle. So that's not the kind of good or bad we're going to be talking about in this class. We're going to be talking about moral goodness and moral badness. Okay, so strictly speaking, we're going to talk about some of the terms. So right and wrong, good and bad, what these terms mean. So strictly speaking, we're going to be using right and wrong to describe actions and good and bad to describe people. Now, this is really just to help us make, the distinction, or make it clear how a good person can do a wrong action and a bad person can do a right action. If we keep these, terms separately, good and bad applying to people and right and wrong applying to actions, it's going to help us, be clear about what we're trying to say. Now, right can mean a couple different things. It could either mean obligatory, and obligatory means it's wrong not to perform that thing. Like you have an obligation to do that thing. Now, right can also mean permitted. Permitted means it's not wrong to perform that thing. You are allowed to perform that thing. Now, wrong can mean prohibited. Wrong to perform that action. Right? That's what wrong means. It's prohibited. Now, in terms of obligation, that would mean you're obligated not to do that thing. You're obligated to not do wrong things. And finally, this one is probably one most of you have never heard of before. It's called supererogatory. It means going above and beyond. It's good. It's an action that's good to do, but it's not required of you. This is an instance of charity. So it's good for you to donate money or time or canned foods to help the poor and charitable, but it's not required of you. You have no moral obligation to do those things. Or, some people are going to argue. So we're going to go over the 5 basic principles that are used in bioethics. There's going to be autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, and utility. So those are going to be the 5 principles that we're going to look at. These are going to be derived from larger ethical theories, and then more specifically, when we have conflicting principles, we might look at what kinds of principles there are. So there's 2 kinds of principles. There are absolute principles, which these are going to apply in all cases without exceptions, and then we're going to have prima facie principles, which are going to apply in most circumstances unless there's some reason that it shouldn't apply, some overriding factor, something like that. So first we're going to talk about non-maleficence. You've probably heard of this principle under a different name or phrase of do no harm. A lot of people think this comes from the Hippocratic Oath. It's not exactly from the exact text, but the idea was there. So this is a very old classic principle. And the idea is that you shouldn't deliberately cause harm to your patient. That is wrong. You're violating the principle of non-maleficence by deliberately causing harm. Also, so doctors should think about this in the positive way of due care. They have a right to provide due care for their patients. This is acting reasonably and responsibly to try and minimize the harm. Further, even if the treatment doesn't cause harm, exposing your patient to potential harm is violating this principle. So in this instance, the outcome doesn't justify the means. If there was an easier way that put the person in less risk, that would have the same outcome, you should have done that. So it was wrong to subject them to that potential risk if there was an alternative that didn't have that risk. Okay, so that's the principle of non-maleficence. Autonomy is another bioethics principle that we often appeal to. And this one's been super controversial lately. And we'll actually get into it in the discussions, how much autonomy should a person have, how much paternalism is too much paternalism. But for now, I'm just trying to get the basics of the principle down. So the idea is that, we have our, a rational capacity for decision-making and self-determination. This comes from deontology, and they argue that, each person has an intrinsic moral worth because they have this capacity to reason and, self-direct their life. And because people have this, we shouldn't violate other people's autonomy. Making an autonomous decision means that they're fully informed. So by lying to someone, you're violating their autonomy. Autonomy is also one of these rights that are one of the principles that is going to be prima facie, which means that we have it on our face, but there are certain circumstances where we're going to be able to intervene and limit a person's autonomy. So this is the foundation of the harm principle. You can be autonomous up until you start harming other people. The other instances of this, maybe you're harming yourself. So a drug addict or someone who's mentally ill, we might violate their autonomy by forcing them to go to rehab or living in these houses or force medications, whatever it is, we might be violating their autonomy for their good or for our own good. So these are instances when our autonomy can be overridden, and it's not wrong. We're not violating the principle in those instances. So similar to non-maleficence is the principle of beneficence. This is the idea of being nice to each other, being good to each other. This is more than just trying to prevent harm. This is trying to promote goodness and wellness within each other. The medical profession has a duty to do this because that's what the profession is. They're trying to provide help and care for other people. Whereas for other people, the principle of beneficence outside of the healthcare setting is going to be a supererogatory principle. Not everyone is going to be required to be nice to everyone in all circumstances. It's nice if we were, but it's not required. Utility is another principle that we're going to be appealing to in bioethics. This is going to be the idea of, calculating the good versus bad outcomes. This is going to come from our utilitarian framework and utilitarian ethical point of view, where we're calculating the good versus the bad, and the good actions are the ones that tend to promote happiness, and the bad actions are the ones that tend to promote the reverse of happiness. This is often used because in real life, we can't just do good or just avoid harm. Oftentimes our actions are going to have a mix of good and bad. So we're going to use the principle of utility to decide between two actions. If there's two courses of treatment, which one's going to have the most overall favorable outcome versus the other one where it's going to be favorable but maybe not the most favorable or something like that. Another instance when the principle of utility is applied to is in terms of public health. We have to think about, which principles or rules are we going to follow that are going to have the greatest health benefits for everyone in general. It's not just about individuals, but it's about the entire public health. So they might use utilitarian calculations to try and figure that out. One of the other principles we're going to be looking at in bioethics is going to be the principle of justice. This is generally a political principle, but it applies here in some circumstances. So a lot of people might think of justice as being, retributive. This is going to be, a just punishment for a wrong action. That's not the kind of justice we're going to be thinking about. We're going to be thinking about more distributive justice. How should the society's benefits and burdens be distributed amongst the citizens? So there's a few different ways of thinking about this, and as I said, this is usually a very political topic. So if you're more interested in this, totally recommend taking a political philosophy class. But for this class, we're just really thinking about it, and it's mostly going to be applying to healthcare. How much healthcare should a person get? So we have two opposing views and then the middle ground in between. One opposing view is going to be the libertarian point of view. This is going to emphasize personal freedom. Markets and, without interference should be making the decisions. The government's role should be limited to just a night watchman. You shouldn't take from the haves and give to the have-nots. No one is entitled to health care, and individuals are only entitled to what they can acquire. Now, in contrast to that point of view, we have the other point of view, which is going to be the egalitarian point of view. A just distribution of society's benefits and burdens is going to be distributed equally. Everyone should be treated equally means everyone has an equal access to, minimum goods and services. And so part of that minimum goods and services is going to be healthcare. So on this egalitarian point of view, healthcare would be guaranteed for every single individual. Now, these 2 points of view, the egalitarian and the libertarian point of view, are going to be opposing, and very few people, I think, fall on that far end of either end of the spectrum. Most people fall somewhere in the middle, and that's when we're going to be looking for that middle ground, where we're going to find, a healthy respect for, autonomy and allowing people to make their own decisions, but at the same time mandating that, basic healthcare needs of the least well-off are also met. So that's the principle of justice we're going to try and find. We're going to try and find that middle ground. How much infringement on autonomy is an okay thing, and how much personal freedom do we really need, and how much what is that minimum health care? What is that minimum basic that the egalitarian is going to say we need? So yeah, that's the principle of justice.